Something that really differentiates us from any other species out there is our inherent ability to choose goodness or evil. Welcome to the Nomad's Notebook podcast, the show where we tackle life's biggest questions. My name is Joe Maxwell, and today I want to talk about something age-old. It's a question that's been discussed for hundreds of years, and it's this concept of nature versus nurture. Specifically, a question, are people born good or evil? And what got me thinking about this was I recently watched Schindler's List maybe a couple weeks ago, and if you haven't watched it, I would highly recommend that you check it out. It's an absolutely incredible story, and it's all true. For those of you who haven't seen it, I'll just give a quick recap right now. It centers around the story of a man named Oskar Schindler. He's a German. He's operating before World War II and also into the war. And he goes into the war with a mindset that he wants to make as much money as he possibly can. There's not really any altruism to his character, at least nothing that you can see in those early years, the late 30s and the early 40s. He's simply just out for himself and he's trying to make money. He runs a factory. He creates all kinds of different munitions for the German army. But as time goes on, as it gets, into the 1940s, and he starts to see where the Nazis are taking the war, and specifically what they're doing to the Jews and other minorities through the Holocaust, something changes in him, or it at least appears to change. Maybe it's just something that was already a part of his character before, but there does seem to be a transition towards the end of the war, and he decides he's going to stop his focus on making money, and his sole responsibility in life becomes saving as many Jews as he possibly can. He tosses everything else out the window. He bribes commanders of concentration camps in order to keep Jews off of those trains. He basically spends his entire fortune, and in the end, he saves over 2,000 Jews. That's one side of the story that's very interesting, this change that seems to happen within Oskar Schindler. But also, the way that Spielberg did the movie was he created two characters, or he told two stories. On the one hand was Schindler, on the other hand was a concentration camp commander named Goth. As the story goes on, there's a stark contrast between the two. On the one hand, you have altruism and good in the form of Schindler, and on the other hand, you have just a horrific animal in the form of Goth. He treats people absolutely terribly. He has no empathy for people. So what I got to thinking about was, what was the reason for the difference between these two men? Because presumably they had reasonably similar upbringings. They were both upper middle class, and they both had an interest in materialism, at least to an extent. Goth probably more than Schindler, but that was displayed early on in the war. And yet when push came to shove, Schindler proved that he was a genuinely good person, and Goth showed his true characters. He was an absolute animal. I think the main reason behind the differences in their actions comes down to inherent beliefs. Schindler clearly believed, even if he didn't know it early on in the war, that all people, just based on being human beings, are inherently equal, regardless of their race, their sex, or their religion. And Goth, on the other hand, clearly did not believe this based on the way that he treated the Jews in his camp. They were clearly just animals to him, and he could do whatever he wanted. The movie, to me, also demonstrates that power and money are a magnifier of whatever someone's true character is. Schindler was very motivated by money early on in the war, but towards the end of the war, I think part of what sparked this shift in his character was this realization that money just isn't all that meaningful in of itself. And probably, for some people at least, you have to actually go through the process of making a pile of money before you find that out. But Schindler clearly found it out because he spent nearly his whole fortune in saving human beings. And he clearly had a realization that, hey, human beings are a lot more important than the money that I'm going to be making doing this. So in the end, I was left wondering, what was the cause of the difference, the stark difference between these two people? Was it just something that was inherent from their birth, or was it something that came about later on in time? And this is an absolutely age-old argument, and one that's been going on since the 17th century, and honestly probably a lot before that even. They just didn't record it. But two philosophers, their names were Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, had opposing views on this. Hobbes believed that by nature, humans are nasty people, and it's only the outliers through great effort who can overcome this nature. But on the flip side, Rousseau believed that people were born good and that civilization is actually what turns them evil. Now, it's an interesting topic to discuss and think about and try to find conclusions, but there's actually some science that we can put behind it as well. In a 2017 study, they tested hundreds of babies as young as 6 months old up to 2 years old. They showed them a cartoon where there were three characters. There was a bully who would attack a victim, and then at the last minute, a third agent would come in, stop the bully, and save the victim. And after watching the cartoon, these babies were asked to pick who their favorite character was. Almost without exception, all of them chose the agent, the one who was doing good. So this might lead you to believe that maybe babies seem to have a slight tilt towards altruism just inherently. Either that, or maybe even by that early age of 6 months, they've already been influenced enough by their parents to lead them in a certain direction. We might never have an answer on that, but it is an interesting study and it does give us some information. So where does that leave us on our question, the nature versus nurture debate? Well, personally, I believe that the answer is somewhere in the middle. I think babies can be born with certain traits that might leave them predisposed to becoming evil or bad when they're adults. Things like narcissism, maybe a lack of empathy, sadism even. I think people can be born with these things, or at the very least, they can be born with things that make them more predisposed to developing these things later. But beyond that, there is a whole lifetime of parenting decisions when the person's young, and then external circumstances, treatment by other people, and all these things work together and they shape a person into who they are as an adult. So I think it's when nature meets nurture in a very particular way that you get outliers on either side of the equation. So taking this back to a broader scale now, I think the most incredible thing about humans, and something that really differentiates us from any other species out there, is our inherent ability to choose goodness or evil. All other animals, they act completely off instinct, and yet we have two things that make us different. We have an innate sense of what is right and what's wrong, and also the ability to choose which path that we're going to go down. So I'd like to wrap things up with a quote that says, "No man chooses evil because it is evil. He only mistakes it for happiness, the good that he seeks." Thanks for listening.